Welcome, everyone, to another virtual Iowa Bibliophiles. I'm Liz Reardon, Outreach and Engagement Librarian for Special Collections, and we are happy to have you join us for this talk on pulp paperback books, predominantly from the 1940s through the 60s. Leading our group tonight is Associate Professor of Cinematic Arts, English, and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, Corey Creekmur. He is also affiliated with the South Asian Studies program. Corey's work and research is extensive. While much of his teaching and research focuses on international popular cinema, cross-cultural film genres, and popular discourses of race, gender, and sexuality, his teachings also explore Marxism, psychoanalysis, and the relation between film stars and fans. He serves on the editorial advisory board of the journal Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, and he is also the general editor of the Comics Culture book series for Rutgers University Press. He has co-edited 3 volumes, as well as written numerous essays ranging from topics on Hindi film songs to Gary Cooper to sound and post-9/11 films. Corey is a familiar and friendly face to many of us in Special Collections, and we are delighted to finally get to see his own collection of books. A reminder that this talk will be recorded, but the Q&A after will not. And for this talk, it is strongly recommended you have Zoom on speaker view instead of gallery, which you can change at the top right corner of your screen. So thank you so much, Corey, for coming tonight and talking to us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, every phrase is now a little odd. I was going to say delighted to be here, but where's here? When people, cordially begin Zoom meetings and say, "Hi, how are you?" I've started to pause and think that's such a complicated question. The nicety is to say I'm fine, but then you start to think, well, okay, let's just run with fine. But anyway, I am delighted to be here wherever here is in virtual space. But I'm going to say that I nostalgically or maybe perversely or however you want to interpret it, I wanted to hang on to something like the conventional Bibliophiles meeting. So I'm very sorry that we're not in Special Collections and, with a lot of tables in front of us. And you can't tell right now, you'll get a better sense in just a second, but I'm at the Obermann Center where there was a table sufficient for me. And I'm surrounded by paperback books. So they're just off your screen, but I wish you were in the room with them. I wish you could smell them. I wish you could hold them in your hands, and even at the risk of the paper crumbling, because of course they're cheaply made. But what I wanted to hang on to was a kind of show and tell. And so I thought the obvious thing to do, or the convenient thing to do, would have been to make slides, right? But then I thought, well, if I could just get the slides I'd get the images of the books off the web, and I could tell you some interesting things about them and all, but I wanted you to see real books insofar as you can see real books. Despite, imagine please the pulpy smell and the feel of the paper and all that kind of thing. And so what I'm going to try to do, and it may fail miserably, but I'm going to give it a shot, is to simply hold stuff up like this, hoping you'll be able to see it. And I just realized I can't see myself large, so I can't test how everything looks. The main problem I'm going to have to deal with is just also the frustration it'll cause, just like a 3D effect, holding things up for you to glimpse at and then probably pull them away. But I'm fighting with glare. And so I'm going to do my best. I've experimented a little that if I hold something up and I can tell there's glare on it, if I tweak it just a little bit, I can kind of fix that, but it's not going to be perfect, I promise. So let me begin and just say some very general things. I teach popular culture broadly. And one of the things I do more often for the English department is popular literature. And we deal with the popularity in many ways. Why was this book enjoyable to people? Why was this a bestseller? What's been its impact and effect? But one of the things I'm dealing with is also the material quality of popular literature. So what does it mean that literature of various forms has been produced cheaply? And one of the primary ways in the 20th century, at least, that literature was produced cheaply was through the paperback book. And so I'm often asking students who are not used to this, you folks, this won't be so foreign, but I'm asking them to think about the significance of format, not just the text inside, that say any edition of Heart of Darkness presumably contains, with good editing and everything, the same text. And so in a sense, students are prone to think any copy of Heart of Darkness is basically the same thing. And what I want them to think about is the differences that the container makes, the format makes. What does it mean that you have a leather-bound first edition, and what does it mean that you have a cheap paperback, or variations in between? And so that's what I'm emphasizing in terms of format. Let me give you the sort of briefest, fastest, streamlined history of the paperback. First, acknowledging, as many of you will know, the modern paperback has many precursors, at least going back to the 18th and 19th century, if not earlier. But many publishers, particularly in Germany, and then later in Britain, but in some fashion all around the world, are by the 18th century and 19th century, and this all has to do with, of course, with the rise of literacy, they're publishing more books, but also cheaper books. There's a growing class of people who can read and want to read and desire to read, but can't afford expensive books. And so this is a goodwill gesture for those people to get books to them. But of course, it's mercenary too. There's a brand new market. But they're not going to pay a lot, or they can't pay a lot for books, but they'll pay a little bit. And so there's a long history of popular literature, and just in the US, this would include things like pulp magazines, but the dime novel, curiously named, flimsy little paper publication. In Britain, the yellowback, what were called railway books, shilling shockers, all sorts of cheap versions of popular literature. The modern paperback, the paperback is you're familiar with it. And what I mean is the small mass market paperback. Now you're more likely familiar with what's called the trade paperback, the larger size, more approximate to the size. If a book goes from hardcover to paper, a literary book, it likely now goes into trade paperback, this larger size. But the mass market paperback, the small, or as the American company would call it, becomes almost synonymous, even though it's a trade name, the pocket book, the book small enough to put in your pocket. This begins in effect in 1935 with Penguin in Britain, and Penguin has been much discussed. If anyone wants references later, don't hesitate to contact me. There's been a lot written about Penguin as a company, about the sort of eccentric founders and figures associated with the rise of Penguin. And Penguin is a success pretty much from the start, from 1935. They establish a practice that the US will pick up of releasing groups of books. So in 1935, they released 10 books as a kind of trial. How are these going to go? The legend, and it may only be a legend, is that one of the founders of Penguin, Alan Lane, there are three brothers, the Lane brothers, is about to take a railway trip, and he wants something to read on the train, and he goes to the stall at the train station, and he looks, and it's all, to his mind, tawdry, lurid, badly written, popular material. And he thinks, what if there were a good book? What if good books were available? Well-known authors, classics, but in these cheap versions. And that's what Penguin attempts and succeeds wildly at. In 1946, so over a decade later, they begin the Penguin Classics line with an edition of Homer's The Odyssey. So what they're actually publishing first are recent bestsellers, popular books, but they're publishing in a wide range of genres. They're publishing crime fiction, Agatha Christie, they're publishing nonfiction, histories, a wide range of things. And some of you may know Penguin color-coded their books. So I like crime novels, so crime novels were green, other books were blue. But I'm not showing you any penguins because at first penguins were dull in terms of covers. There was nothing on the covers except the titles. And as you might imagine, what becomes really interesting about paperbacks is the covers. This is a case where you do judge a book by its cover in many ways. I'm going to focus on the US context. It's the one I know best, but in this case, the US context is deeply influenced by what they see as the success in Britain. Pocketbooks in 1938 in the United States seeks to emulate the success of Penguin. All of this is happening in the context of the International Great Depression, and then later World War II will impact this. 35 is not the greatest time to start a business. 38 is still not the best time to start a business, but they're taking into account the economic impact of the Depression and thinking, but there's still a desire to read. And again, literacy rates are just growing and growing. And so they're going to step in. Pocketbooks begins with this. Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. They test it. They do a sort of research and development. They produce this book. This is already a well-known, popular best-selling book. Pearl Buck is not much read anymore, but is an extremely successful popular author in the period. I believe she won the Pulitzer Prize, among other accolades. They know this is a popular book, but they don't know that this format will be popular. And so they test it. They create a batch of copies. Now they're rare collector's items because there's something like 500 copies. They send some out for people to test and they get feedback. And people say, I love it. I love the price. It's 25 cents. The format is nice. I can take it anywhere. I can take it on a trip. I can put it in my pocket, as you say. The logo, I don't know if you can see it, but probably all of you know, very small down there, is the kangaroo, whose name is Gertrude. And so the pocket, and that's modeled after the cute penguin on Penguin Books in the UK. And this is a big hit. So this gives them the idea, and they completely, again, emulate Penguin. They release 10 books. They say, let's try batches of 10, all released at the same time and see how it goes. And the number one, so The Good Earth kind of falls out of this category because it's tested first. The first book Pocket releases is Hilton's Lost Horizon. And Lost Horizon, I don't know if you can see, well, it's number one. And they list on the back, here are their 10 first books. So if you like this one, get the others. I like that number 10 is Bambi. In both cases, they're seeking a range of genres, some nonfiction, some fiction. And Lost Horizon had been published a few years before, didn't do especially well, did okay, but as many of you will know, it was made into an extremely popular film by Frank Capra. That generated more, it's an early version of a tie-in, that generated more attention to the book. But in the meantime, he had published Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and it was a huge bestseller. So eventually, and collectors of these things get a little obsessive about this really cheap little book, but they get obsessive about editions. And eventually, I think there's something like 80 editions of Lost Horizon. It sells extremely well for at least a decade. There's a little kind of conceit to these early paperbacks that goes away. They realize they don't really need to do this. And it's end papers. So the first pocket books have, like hardcovers would, red, in this case, end papers. They eventually decide, that's a sort of nicety we don't need. And they go in from there. In this little history, and there's going to be a lot more visual aid in just a second. In this little history, the next major shift, these take off despite the end of the Depression, the beginning of World War II. This is a hit. This is working well, and other companies are going to jump on the bandwagon and start up their own publication. For this period, I mean, what's really interesting about pretty much all of the late 30s and almost all of the 40s is this is all reprint. It's reprint of popular books. It's reprint increasingly of classics. And then in 1950, Fawcett, a long-standing publisher, they publish lots of magazines and other things, comic books. Fawcett gets into the paperback market, and they come up with the idea of paperback originals. We can commission books that will appear for the very first time in paperback. They won't be reprints. And they advertise this over and over on the covers, not a reprint. When I show these to students are often a little baffled. Why are they saying not a reprint? it was also conventional before this to let people know, full and complete edition. In some cases, unexpurgated, because many of them actually were. But whenever you were doing the full edition, they tended to do this. But then the byword becomes not a reprint, an original publication. This is a boon for popular genres. I'll make a sort of extravagant claim, but if you push me on it, I think I could back it up. We would not have modern science fiction the way we do now without the paperback original, without the ability to publish for the first time in paperback by some prominent science fiction writers. Crime writers tend to be publishing like Hammett and Chandler in hardcover and going to paperback, but a whole new generation of crime writers will publish for the first time in paperback. And then I'm going to talk about some unusual cases in just a minute. But science fiction, crime, the Western, a range of nonfiction categories take off with the paperback original. And then the last thing I'm going to say, sort of prefatory, is it may surprise some of you, maybe not others, that these cheap, ephemeral, disposable books that in their very format were not meant to last, become the fascination for some collectors. And there's a whole apparatus, as there is for other things. There are zines and journals devoted to paperback collecting. Paperback Quarterly is one of the first. One of the longest running is called Paperback Parade. And there are, believe it or not, critical studies now of the significance of paperbacks. If I have to point to one, but there's a good little shelf of them, I'll note Paula Rabinowitz's book called American Pulp. And yes, I kind of stole her title and rearranged it. But it's a historical study of the way in which in which modernism came to Main Street America through the paperback. It's through the paperback that people are reading Hemingway and Faulkner and other key modernists, and it's through the paperback that people are reading Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Ann Petrie, some of the key African American writers of the 20th century. So she discusses that. So now I'm going to make a kind of a shift, keeping my eye on the clock too, to just talk about some sort of subtopics, I suppose, some phenomenon here. And one of the things I'll mention, and here's again where I'm a little worried about how the glare will work, but one of the ways in which, old stuff in new packages can be sold is you jazz it up in some way. You put a new cover on it, or frankly, you exploit it. And so one of the things that's fascinating for people who are interested, maybe not in the sort of popular genres I'm interested in, but in high culture, is the way in which literary classics get repackaged. So you have, and again, I hope you can see, you have this sort of edition of Heart of Darkness, which has a half-nude woman on the cover and a kind of tawdry scene, not found in the novel at all. You have, makes this book a quite racy book. This is Hemingway's, I'm not looking at them, The Sun Also Rises. And the wording on it, I don't know if you can tell, is all about the main character's mysterious injury. The secret is he's impotent. That's what they're playing up. Rider Haggard's classic 19th century novel, She, gets this sort of lurid cover. This just becomes a very common thing in this period. This is the first paperback edition of 1984. Don't know if you can tell that. This is the first cover of Catcher in the Rye. Some of you will know the famous completely red cover, not an illustration later. I like this one because it's just so lurid. This is William Faulkner's novel, Mosquitoes. Faulkner particularly gets a lot of this, the language, little steamy stories of the Deep South and, that kind of thing. So one of the curious things that's happening is the way in which these popular books are being reprinted. Another thing that fascinates me is the way in which popular books, in the sense of selling well, get reprinted and repackaged so frequently. So Ann Petrie's novel, The Street, one of the classics of the Harlem Renaissance, gets a cover like this that I hope you can kind of see. Gets reprinted in the 50s with this cover. This looks to me like Dorothy Dandridge, though the character in the novel looks nothing like that. And then these are actually shortened versions. This is the full book. You can see it's fairly thick. So that sort of reprinting. This gets more complicated with books like this. This book by, I don't know this writer at all. Oh, I do actually. Gail Wilhelm wrote a lot of popular books. This novel called No Letters for the Dead, you might buy and read. It's kind of a crime novel. And then, you know, looking for something else to read, you may think, oh, I read a book by her, I liked it. Here's a different book called No Nice Girl. That looks interesting. If you can see very small, it tells you that the original title is No Letters for the Dead. And then, you know, 2 weeks later, or probably a year later, you might pick up a book called Paula, which if you look real closely is also No Letters for the Dead. Same book, 3 different covers. This isn't as deceptive, but do any of you know the book Let's Make Merry? Once a bestseller, really sleazy, basically a kind of really sexist sort of pickup guide for men, but had a bizarre life. Let's Make Merry, a different edition, a different edition, a different edition, and a different edition. They just keep cranking out new editions of the same book with these covers. You also sometimes get interesting things like this going on. This is a crime novel by A.A. Fair. A.A. Fair is better known as Earl Stanley Gardner, the creator of Perry Mason. In paperbacks, you have a lot of people writing under multiple names, as you did in pulps and other forms. But this sort of, you know, seductive cover, you see a woman putting on her clothes after, presumably, some assignation. But this is actually the second cover because they censor the first one. I wonder if you can see the differences between the two. One is a bit more revealing. That's the same book. These are 2 completely different novels. But, you know, if the cover worked once, why not use it again on a different book? So I'm interested in that sort of phenomenon of a reprint. And again, what I try to encourage students, you know, who think it's just the same book with all these different covers, but how were they marketing it to a different group at a different time? How were they trying to sometimes deceive and make people think this is something fresh when they've seen it before? Let me shift. Let me say something about other formats. So what I've shown you, you know, with slight variations in size, you know, this is a pretty standard format, set in place more or less by Penguin, followed by Pocket and pretty much everybody else in the US. And again, there'll be books that are a little taller and a little shorter and that kind of thing. But at different times, people have tried different formats. And so let me highlight a couple of those. This is just, but a number of people did this. So here's the book as you would read it by Arthur C. Clarke, science fiction novel, but the cover is printed to go like that. So just a sort of fun variation, but actually quite common to have a book. It means, you know, displaying them was odd because they're like this on a rack, but that's how the picture functions and even how the back cover copy functions, but you don't read it that way. So that variation. At times, if you had a short story, not a long novel, you could publish in, this is actually a famous cover by the science fiction Robert Heinlein. But you may see, this is almost like a little pamphlet. And it's cheaper. Paperbacks had settled on 25 cents. This is 10 cents. More justifiable for this small book. And these were published in Chicago during World War II. They are called, I always forget what they're actually called. They're called quick readers. You have to see it maybe next to another book. these teensy little books. Again, often of well-known text. This is Anita Luce's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which appeared in all sorts of different editions. But there's a little conceit to these, so very small little thing. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it. There's this sort of optical illusion that it looks like a thick book along the spine. So it looks like you've got a kind of, hardcover 200-page book, but it's of course this little pamphlet. Special Collections has actually a nice collection of these, which are interesting. This is published during World War II. This is I know the acronym, ASE is a American Service Edition. And these small little, well, some were thicker, but these little pamphlets were made to be given to servicemen. Hundreds of these were produced. The range of what they published is fascinating, from very popular material, even comic strips at times, to literary classics. This is a selection of Walt Whitman. Shout out to my colleague Ed Folsom. And these are fascinating because they weren't meant to be kept. They actually assumed soldiers would take these onto the battlefield, read them if and when they had quiet time, and leave them. Pass them along perhaps, but leave them. They weren't meant to last, and the fact that they last is kind of curious. They weren't allowed to be sold. An agreement was made with American publishers. This is for the boys, this is a war effort. We send these out. So there were no profits made, but for that reason, they couldn't be sold. So those. And then I'm cheating a little because I'm going to Britain, but these were distributed widely in the United States. What was called the infantry edition, Penguin released something like about 40 books, all with roughly uniform covers, for some of them directly for soldiers, others for the family of soldiers who wanted to know what's going on in the war. Interesting. So aircraft recognition, you might understand, but even a topic like psychology for the fighting man. This is a book on what soldiers are going through, what they might have to go through when they come home, how their families are coping. Fascinating to me that something like that happened. And these are both books of, they're published on the oblong format of art by soldiers, produced during the war and then collected in these editions. So the whole topic into itself is the response of paperback publishers to the war effort. Okay, making abrupt, rude transitions. Oh, another format I wanted to say something about, and one of the strengths, as probably all of you know, of Special Collections is its science fiction collections. And so I'm not going to show you much science fiction. I have some, but Special Collections has a vast collection of science fiction paperbacks. Many of them, again, the first appearance of a key figure, a key writer, things like that. And one interesting publication idea was the publisher Ace, a major publisher of science fiction. This is actually a quite well-known science fiction, Fritz Lieber's, the big time, were published in these dual editions. They're called Ace doubles. And so you read this, and then you flip it over, and you get another novel on the other side. And then you get a spine that gives you both of them. This was mostly science fiction, but other things were published, crime novels, as Ace doubles. They're controversial now because they were often edited, sometimes with the authors not giving permission. But one of the rarest collectible paperback books is an Ace double, and I forget what's on the other side, but on one side is Junkie by William Lee, who was William S. Burroughs. So the first publication of William S. Burroughs' first novel, Junkie, appeared in this format. Okay, let me make, again, a sort of transition. I want to say something about the topicality of paperbacks. So I've emphasized they're going back and bringing forward classics. You all know the convention of, you wait a few years after the book has had its run in hardback, and then you move it into cheaper paperback. Then you've got the paperback originals. They're not following that pattern. And again, eventually hundreds of paperback originals. They also, with the paperback original, you can do something, which is you can do real up to the minute, what's the latest trend or obsession or scandal. And a lot of books respond to that. So this is a fairly random grouping, I will admit, but I have things like, just the fascination with celebrity after the war. So a little biography of Bridget Bardot when she is at the height of her popularity. A book about Marilyn Monroe called Will Acting Spoil Marilyn Monroe? So speaking to this, I can't help but, again, as you've heard, I'm in gender sexuality studies, and I can't help but show you this curious edition, The Loves of Liberace. Not what you think. All about all the women who adore Liberace, but doing its own kind of cultural work. The topicality of John Hershey's famous New Yorker story on Hiroshima, which moved quickly into paperback. And here with a kind of, for the most serious topic imaginable, a kind of odd science fiction-y cover. When it was reprinted, I find this one actually much more powerful. I don't know if you can see the little airplane flying above the mushroom cloud. And while things like that are being published, things that now look painfully naive to us like this are coming out to an anxious public. How to Survive an Atomic War. It actually suggests you could. A little lighter than that, I like this one. I Drive the Turnpikes and Survive. In case some of us, with the newfangled phenomenon of the turnpike fear, we might not. I'm interested in the status of important books like Anne Frank's diary, which most people read as a paperback, was a massive success as a paperback, after doing very well as a hardcover. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, crucial to the women's movement. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the key text in the environmental movement of the period, things like that. As we move into the 50s, though, one of the two, I'll pick two of the areas that are exploited most fully are the obsession with the juvenile delinquent. Well, let me start there. There were older books. This book that appeared in paperback actually stems from the 20s, called Teenage Vice. It's written by Courtney Riley Cooper, who was a sort of associate of J. Edgar Hoover. This old, book about teenage gangs of the 20s or 30s gets picked up in the 50s when there's this obsession with the juvenile delinquent. So this is this old book, not relevant at all to the 50s, but kind of gussied up for the 50s. One of the things I like to have my students do when they look at a group of books like this is talk about genre and talk about how genres are conventional. Genres are cliched. They rely on repetition. And so you'll see where I'm going with this. Here are some juvenile delinquent books. This becomes an extremely well-known film, The Blackboard Jungle. This is Even Hunter. I knew him better growing up as Ed McBain, the crime writer. It's the same person. But Blackboard Jungle, I'll do the work for you, even though not knowing you can see. This creates an explosion of books that are, on the one hand, presenting themselves as dealing with a serious social concern, but of course are exploitive. They're also drawing an audience that, is fascinated by this. So this is also Hunter. These are short stories. The Jungle Kids. Teenage Jungle. Jailbait Jungle. Teenage Jungle. The Neon Jungle. Jungle becomes just this sort of obsessive, repeated word. I'm looking, I read a book about juvenile delinquents. What else? Oh, jungle, jungle, jungle. Okay, jungle books. what do teenage juvenile delinquents do? They rumble. So gang rumble, rumble on the docks, the big rumble, rumble at the housing project, or let's just keep it simple, rumble. This is the science fiction writer Harlan Ellison's first book. And that sort of, you know, unapologetic repetition for the market, give them what they want and give them exactly what they had before, marks this. The other, and watching the clock, I may end up, well, I'm going to try to slip in two more things, two more topics. One of the other fascinating, absolutely fascinating topics of the 1950s, I have to stretch over for a second, be right back, is what is now summarized as lesbian pulp. In the wake of the Kinsey reports, among other things, there is an explosion of books about lesbians, whether named as such or not. The book that sort of, it's not the first, but which inaugurates this just amazing explosion of books on this topic. There are books about gay men produced in the period, but nothing close to the number of books about lesbians. I need to say a couple things. Lesbian pulp is mostly written by straight men for straight male readers. That's the common assumption. What happens in lesbian pulp? Lesbian women see the error of their ways and they settle down and marry a man, or they commit suicide. That tends to be over and over and over what happens in lesbian pulp, with some exceptions that I'll get to. The book that starts this is Vin Packer's book, Spring Fire, which from, I think it is Fawcett Gold Medal is the publisher. They don't know what they've got. They release this and it sells quickly 1 million copies. And then they will re-release it over and over. They do not anticipate that this book, advertised as a story once told in whispers, now frankly, honestly written, they don't anticipate it'll be this runaway success. Vin Packer is, her real name is Mary Jane Meeker, and she also published as Anne Aldrich. So this is, again, one of these curious sort of links. But you'll see here also this sort of, like Rumble and Jungle, you'll see this sort of repetition. So Strange Sisters, this is actually another edition of Strange Sisters. The Strange Path, another edition. Diana, subtitled The Story of a Strange Love. Strange. Over and over and over, the marker, if it's not explicit in the title, and it rarely is, there are very few titles that have lesbian in the title, strange becomes the signal to readers. So does Twilight. These are women in the twilight, Twilight women, Twilight, strange Twilight women. You know, over and over and over, that becomes the marker. The most fascinating thing now to scholars about this phenomenon is it clearly allowed lesbian writers, seeing what was going on, to enter this market. And so even if they were disgusted by, you know, particularly the endings, the notorious endings to these books, or they thought, you know, this is clearly written by someone who has no clue how lesbians feel or act or what their world is like, because it's a market, lesbian writers start to appear in it. One of the most significant in this regard, although it's the only book she writes along these lines, is she writes as Claire Morgan, but this is Patricia Highsmith. Her book, The Price of Salt. If you know the film Carol from a few years ago, this is the source of Carol. Highsmith had become a success as a very young woman with her crime novel, Strangers on a Train, because Hitchcock makes a popular film about it. She says to her publisher, her editor, I've got another novel. It's about a lesbian relationship. He says, you've just launched your career. No way. I'm not going to let you do that. They finally agree she'll do it under a pseudonym. The Price of Salt is famous, infamous in the period, because the couple survives. The couple goes off together. They don't die, they don't reform. And then the key figure in all of this is a woman named Anne Bannon, who begins to write a series of books. This is one of them. Anne Bannon is writing primarily about lesbians in Greenwich Village. And it's a common story when people have done oral interviews with women who are reading this in the period. You have story after story of, say, a woman in a small town. These were distributed widely. A woman in a small town reads one of these novels, and the common story often is, oh, I thought I was the only one. I didn't know anyone else felt this way. And now I learn there are others, and there are bars in a place called Greenwich Village where these others gather. So, you know, even the negative novels, many women said this brought to their attention for the very first time that lesbians existed and congregated in various places. So even the one, you know, and you have a lot of stories of women saying, oh, I love the book, and then I skipped the last chapter because I knew what would happen in the last chapter and I didn't want to read that. But before that, you know, it was speaking to me. So those phenomena. The last thing I'm going to slip in real fast is just a leap ahead. By the 1960s, when, you know, the paperback is ubiquitous, it's very common. It's you know, a key way in which Americans read material. There are a number of really interesting innovations that come in. People start to think, well, what, you know, we've had this thing in place for a while. Nobody's done much with the format. What else can be done? And so I don't know how visible this will be, but there are a number of, in effect, paperback magazines, multiple volumes. So this, you can see the hippies on the cover. Defiance is an anthology, but it functions like a, you know, a collection of essays and stories on the counterculture, but in the form of a paperback book. So is this series called Countdown. I think there were 4 of these. And I'm going to say something else too. And this, either called Us or US, you see the very psychedelic cover. But what's going on also, besides the covers, is, and this is one of the most famous from this period, Buckminster Fuller's book, I Seem to Be a Verb. Looks like a conventional paperback, but again, I don't know how well this will come across. A wildly inventive design inside. You know, this is not the sort of thing you would just, you know, basically you have just sort of dull typeface, but a number of designers in this period started to realize the paperback could be used to do really interesting things, or maybe I'll work toward concluding with this, or you could do subversive things in the 60s with a paperback if you were Abby Hoffman and just call your book Steal This Book and dare people going into bookshops to do it. You know, can you imagine the problem for booksellers putting this in their front window and people following the direction of the cover of the book? But this too, again, I won't be able to demonstrate it very well, but is a sort of complicated collage, basically, of all sorts of design elements, different typefaces. There's some versions of this early, but it's really in the 60s where you start to see people think, well, let's take this cheap little quotidian, familiar, everyday object and play with it. So as you probably sense, I could go on. I could show you other kinds of things, but I think I'll stop there. I'd love to hear what kinds of comments or questions people may have, or even, you know, what I always enjoy on this topic is hearing people's, you know, experiences or memories of picking up a paperback that, you know, was something different than just one more paperback, but it was like one you'd never seen before, or you know, you had no idea such books existed, that kind of thing. Those stories are not uncommon. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for putting up with my silly sort of show and tell attempt. Again, in the future, we'll all be in a room together, and you can touch and smell and taste and, you know, hold these things.